Stay tuned with Coach John Brent.
I'm here with the vet, Mr. Ian Griffin.
Man, today's a great day today, Coach.
It is. It's a beautiful day, actually.
It is. Guess what we're going to talk about today?
Something I'm going to probably learn something. I got a feeling.
We're going to discuss our top 5 generals in American history all time.
All time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I might surprise you with a little bit of knowledge, but
just a little bit. Being an American military history major, I don't know. Yeah. I might not. But we're going to discuss that, and some might take them a little controversial, and that'd be all right. Those are my 5 generals, and they were his 5 generals. So you tell us your 5 generals.
There you go.
We'll be all right.
All right. So we just start this?
Yeah, go ahead.
Quick. All right. Well, my number 5, and when I think about World War II, and I think about some of the things when you go back and you watch even movies, people always reference this guy, General Patton. So he's one of the most successful combat generals in U.S. history. Yes. He was a tank operator in World War I, which I didn't know until I looked him up and started doing a little bit more research. But his liberation of Germany, and I guess France too, maybe you can tell me if I'm wrong on that, but I know his liberation of Germany was considered to be really key. But when you think about that strong chin, you think about Patton. You also think about the movie Patton.
Yeah.
My dad was a big, what was his name? George. Oh gosh, I can see.
C. Scott.
Yeah, George C. Scott. But anyway, that movie was something that kind of lets you understand who he was. He's a tough guy, good guy.
Yeah. So a couple things I'll say, because my thesis was about the M1 Abrams tank, but during my time in my master's classes in World War I wrote about World War I being the proving ground for the tank, and in World War II I wrote about the Sherman and how it was utilized in World War II, and so it built me up to my master thesis. But Patton and Eisenhower, both when they were younger, they had went out and they got a tank and they played around with it, and they started really what evolved into the tank corps back in World War I. During World War I, they actually stole like a French tank, went around and said, let me try this thing out a little bit. They didn't steal from the French. We had it, but they took it out when they wasn't supposed to. And they said, we can do this better, we can do this better. And so really our tank techniques really derive a lot from Patton, and that's a fact. And he was a phenomenal general in the fact that if you think about this, he was used as a diversionary tactic because he was so respected across the enemy lines that they thought that we would plan no battle plan without him. And we did. We kind of planned going. He didn't liberate France. He went into Germany. Okay. So he did. But they put him on the sidelines, so they thought that we were coming from the port of Calais instead of Normandy, because the Germans were watching him. And they put all these fake tanks up there.
Wow.
The Germans were watching him.
Told you I was learning something today.
Yeah, so what's their number 4, Coach? Oh, no.
What are you talking about? You got to do yours.
I got to do mine. So my number 5 is Eisenhower. Mm-hmm. And we're going to get to a guy in a minute that has Eisenhower and Patton in there a little bit together. But Eisenhower, at the end of the day, he had to sit there and he had to get along with all the Allied forces, and by doing that right there, to plan the European Normandy invasion and things of that nature. Yep. And if you don't think Patton, Bradley, and there's a whole bunch of others, as well as Montgomery, were not all had their little egos to go in there, you're sadly mistaken. Every one of them had their own egos. And even dealing with the people from the French resistance with de Gaulle and all that. So he had to orchestrate that, and I just think that hats off to him, because that is a job that nobody wanted.
Oh, no doubt.
So that was my number 4.
All right, my number 4 is going to be, I don't know a lot about this guy, but what I do know about this guy, Sherman, General Sherman in the Civil War, he wasn't even a career military guy. Mm-hmm. He was a civilian. He was doing what he was doing. War breaks out. He gets involved, and he was one of the best Union military leaders that we had at that time, working next to, actually under, but they say next to, but he was really under, of course, Grant. Yeah. But the Battle of Chattanooga and Vicksburg was his big deal. Now, he was involved in that. And from a standpoint of turning the war, I think that was a big deal. So we hear about Grant, we hear about Lee, but a lot of times we don't hear enough about Sherman. So when we're studying it ourselves, we do talk about Sherman a lot.
So I'll talk a little bit about Sherman, because I think he's Well, some people will say, he's borderline war criminal because he burnt the whole South down.
Right.
Now, you take away the resources, you can't field the army. It's just how kind of things are. And but if you look at Civil War, Sherman and Stonewall Jackson were really the top tier generals under the top general. Okay, and they were the blunt forces. They were their blunt instrument. They were their anvil. And they used them because they were both. Sherman was so in sync with Grant, and Jackson was so in sync with Lee that they used them accordingly. And that was one of the South's major downfalls, is losing Jackson hurt them. But Sherman was phenomenal.
Yeah, just my limited reading on him, it's like, why did we not talk more about him when we hear things like Grant, hear things about Lee? And
but I think the main guy gets the limelight, one, and then two, I think Sherman, to be honest, was the best general the North had to offer.
So he's kind of like the OC coordinator to the coach, I guess.
Yeah.
Right.
And how can you not be pretty bad when your name is Tecumseh, man? Come on.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. All right, so what you got for 4?
So my number 4 is John J. Pershing. And there's a trend here, if you see, initially with mine is Eisenhower. We're picking on the humongous strategic level. And John J. Pershing. John J. Pershing, we just talked about this before we started. Generals being, who was the highest ranking general ever, or who's had 4 stars. But John J. Pershing had the title, the only one to ever have this title, General of the Armies, and not General of the Army. So he had all the armies during.
So he's like the commander-in-chief of the armies outside of being the president. I mean.
Well, yes, because when what had happened was during World War I in the Great War, we sent the humongous expeditionary force over. He was in charge of as the general of the armies. So so a phenomenal guy, Black Jack Pershing.
There you go. Number 3 is one of my favorite guys, is General MacArthur.
MacArthur.
Now, first of all, I always have to make sure my data is correct. Some of this is by memory. He was one of only 5 5-star generals. So if MacArthur is a 5-star general, he's top 5 something.
Yeah.
But what I look at with him is he was the chief of staff of the Army in the 1930s, before he became well known in World War II. But he had a huge role in winning the Pacific.
He did.
And one of the things that I show my kids every year, and I call them kids now, I'm with the inmates, is they love watching Pearl Harbor, and then immediately we throw in now Midway.
Yeah.
And the tide of turning of us getting punched in the mouth, we were trying to be neutral, which was hilarious. We were trying to be neutral, but we couldn't. We got punched in the mouth. Our fleets were not, we were kind of, man, what are we going to do? Are we going to be speaking German, Japanese, what? Yeah. And what they did in the Pacific turned that. And I think MacArthur, some of these generals, I'm glad we're doing this because I don't know that much about military history as this guy does here. I'm a history teacher and I love colonial history and all that, but these guys are like coaches.
Yeah. And
so if you look at it like MacArthur as a coach, he would be like your Vince Lombardi. He would be like your Jimmy Johnson, maybe Bill Belichick. Someone that can just, you don't have to like him.
Yeah.
But you got to respect him. Thank God for it.
So I'll say a couple things about MacArthur, but I'm going to say him more for my number 2.
Okay.
Because there's a guy that influences it all. But MacArthur, dude had ego, man. And dude had ego. Truman had to fire him, he had ego. And he told Truman flat out, dude, you just let me go ahead and push over up into North Korea. I'll push into China and into Russia, and I have them all believing they started it. And we may have a whole different world now today. We also may have a lot of us men in America too. Yeah. Who knows? So he had an ego, and I'll talk about that in a minute. He was a good general. He was a good tactician for sure.
Yeah. Cool.
So my number 3, he's taken a lot of heat as of late, but Robert E. Lee. You cannot ignore the fact of the presence of Robert E. Lee.
Right.
He's taught in our academies as he should be. He fought on the wrong side. That's a fact. Hands down, you take any military historian that peels the onion back and looks at the Civil War, and understand this, the Europeans initially laughed at the Civil War. Mm-hmm. We've got more tank tactics, even though it wasn't tanks, because it's scout maneuvering, out of the Civil War that people can even imagine. There were so many tactics learned out of it. But when anybody, you take Europeans or you take American historians who are true historians that have studied the Civil War, they'll tell you hands down that was the best general there was to offer. in the Civil War.
Well, I don't know. I'll tell you this much. One of the things that I always think about when I think about Robert E. Lee, outside of what you're talking about, is he was so undermanned when it
Yes.
came to military people, just
Yes.
like, millions to just a few million.
People and resources.
Exactly. And what he did to keep them in the battle, and at times looked like they might even win the battle early on, it was him.
So if you take him up, look what he did at Chancellorsville. He scared the living crap out of the North. And then, but there he lost his right-hand man for friendly fire. He lost Stonewall Jackson. But at that point right there, this was his thoughts and what was written down. We're going to go to Gettysburg. We're going to go to the North. We're going to hand them their butt because it's close to the capital, and hopefully they'll stop the war. That's what he wanted. Irregardless of what anybody wants to portray him now, that's what he wanted. Take the war on their front. We kick their butt there. We get the resources we need, and hopefully they'll stop the war and let us be, and then they'll be up north. It would have been two different countries. And understand that was only like 80 or 100, somewhere between 110 and 80 miles to the capital from Gettysburg. I can't remember what it is, somewhere in that range. And history, I've been to Gettysburg three times actually. And if you go to the grounds and you understand how close he was, that our nation was about to be divided, I mean, it is just by fate that he lost. Now, the third day with the Pickett's charge, yes, but on day two, he had the thing won. To be honest, he was that close, and he couldn't see it.
Yeah.
Which was a good thing.
Yeah.
But on the bigger picture, he left Gettysburg, got his butt whipped at Gettysburg, as they say. He left, and we went on another 2-year campaign almost of him surviving, handing the Union their butt most of the times, with the South resources being cut off from him by Sherman.
Yeah.
And he's still managing to make it still a fight that are like, are we going to win this or not?
Respectable.
Yes,
for sure.
With him. And so I think he was a superior, hands down superior tactician. Yeah. And then afterward, irregardless of what anybody wants to say, he went back to saying, okay, I got my butt whipped, I'm surrendered, you're going to put me on this dismal road, but I'm here to do whatever you need me to do.
Yeah.
As a nation. So that's my number 3.
He's one of the figures of our history that are probably most picked on and misunderstood.
Very misunderstood.
My number 2 it was so hard with 1 and 2 with me, was the great General George Washington.
Oh.
And the reason that is, I think of Washington as a coach. He's a very good general. He's a very good, I guess you just call him, he's like a field general where he could, we know how to take the timeouts. We know when it's time to punt. We know when it's time to go for 4th and 1. He's that kind of guy. He wasn't the best military strategist at all. I think he had a really, he needed good OCs and DCs. But when we were struggling trying to survive the winter, trying to keep the Army together, when it could have fell apart because of the weather, the starving. He did it. He kept it together.
I'm going to cover him in a minute, but I'm going to say that he was a good military strategist.
Really?
He was in a whole different league of everybody else at the time. And I'll cover that in a minute though. But
sure. Well, but he did have a lot of experience. I mean, he was in the 7 Years' War. He was in the Continental Army, a Colonial Army, the Continental Army. He did all. I mean, like I said before, we did our presidency. He was the number 1, hands down, because he had so many roles in the beginning of our country. But I do look at him as like a great coach, keeping all the team together, keeping all the generals and like I said, coordinators together, and making sure that everybody was on the field where they were supposed to be at the time they were supposed to be, and making those decisions as a general does that really, you look back at history now, people say, well, he wasn't the greatest early on. He kind of learned from his lessons, but without him, we don't win that war.
We don't. We're not Americans.
No.
So my number 2 is a guy named George C. Marshall. You got the Marshall Plan that came from him. To me, he was, besides Washington, the most selfless general there was. He left the Army, left the military, and got a call that says, hey, we need you to go be the Secretary of Defense for the United States. Packed his bags, told the president, I'll do it. Then he went and told his wife. So he didn't ask his wife. Right. He went and said, I got to go. So he went to Korea. He oversaw that. But George C. Marshall, when you look at Eisenhower, and you look at MacArthur, and you look at Bradley, and you look at Patton, every one of them was in his book that he was mentoring.
Mm.
And in World War II,
he was like Andy Reid,
he was huge. Yes, yeah. He had a book of how he mentored it, and he talked about MacArthur. Mm. He says, I threw him out in the Pacific because the focus wasn't in the Pacific. He threw him out there because he knew he had his ego, and there wasn't as many cameras out there.
So really, he wasn't like the Andy Reid. He was like the Bill Walsh. He was the guy that everybody was
huge.
Oh, I got you.
And so and that's in his memoirs. Is he discusses that he did that, but completely selfless. The nation was completely above him, and he had his pride. He wanted to be a commander in Europe. He wanted to be like that, but he knew that his role as chief of staff, he needed to sit there and push those generals out. So he whispered in Eisenhower's ear. He reeled back Patton. It's
not easy.
It's not easy. He whispered in Bradley's ears, and he threw MacArthur out in the Pacific so there wasn't no news cameras, so he could shut him up. And he knew that he was, Yeah. But to me, the epitome of selfless service to our nation lies with George C. Marshall.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I wish our elected officials could be held to the same standard as him. But when you think about this, there's a rule that you can't be the Secretary of Defense, if you're a retired military until 7 years afterward. And Mattis was the next one after him.
7 years?
7 years afterward. You have to be retired for 7 years. Wow. I don't know Powell. I forgot what Powell, which position he had. So I'm not familiar on all that with him. I do apologize. But with Mattis, they had to get senatorial approval to waive that. Yeah. And this is the example, the reason why you do it. And I will tell you that every time our country has had, I think Powell had expired his time, and then he did it. I'm not sure on all that. We may not have had that position. I have to look at Powell more. But irregardless, when you have George C. Marshall in there and when you have Madison there, you had somebody that was really clicking our country really well. When you have all these, hey, you're part of our party and I like you and I just want you to be one of those guys there to go take over that Secretary of Defense because you fit my dynamics and you contributed to my
You should want the best person for the job.
The best person, hands down, has stars, and that's just the way it is. In regardless. So George C. Marshall, number 2.
Well, I'm going to make it quick on my number 1. I don't even see him on your list, but to me, when I studied the Civil War, Ulysses Grant to me was not only a great general, he was also our 18th president. But I love his nickname was Unconditional Surrender. I've seen that in a couple of spots. I was like, our country was at a crossroad, and we had one to leave and start their own country. You call them what you want to, the Confederate States, United States. And Lincoln got Grant. And for Lincoln to have Grant meant to me that we had our Union when this war was over. Not only the way he did it, but how it had to be done. It had to be convincing. And Grant, to me, is not only a great general, he was a good president, he's been a great American. You look across the whole realm of America from, say 1776 to now, there's been a few guys, and I say he would be in our top 10 of great American that did stuff great for our country when we needed it.
So things I'll say with Grant is he liked his alcohol, of course, and what I saw of him is he was slow creeping death is what he was. He just was relentless. He didn't stop. No matter how many people died on each side, he's still coming at you. Even though you lost 20,000 people, they lost 20,000 people, we're still coming at you.
You got me thinking, did they write that song Creeping Death, Metallica?
They should have written about him, about Grant. But with Grant, this is the deal with Lincoln. Think about this. He fired so many generals. I mean, how
many congressional hearings do we have?
Oh my God, he would have been impeached 3 times by now. He fired so many generals. He fired the general that beat Robert E. Lee in Gettysburg. And he goes, I found Grant. Yeah. And Grant was it, because Grant knew how to execute the Anaconda Plan, which was completely isolate the South and kill the resources.
Yeah, you are right. I mean, we have become and I won't call it a weaker nation, but we've become a different nation where, some of the things that our great leaders did in the past that we had to have done, you look back and look at history, it had to be done. If this was in the political scheme that we have now, you're right. We have so many.
If Patton would have slapped that kid again, this is what would have happened to Patton right now. He would have been court-martialed. He would have been freaking on every TV station. The president would be impeached because of having Patton. And not only that, we would have wiped away any contribution that he had to society of all his battle victories.
That's one of the things that I don't like when we move forward, but I don't like how they wipe away things because somebody had a bad pass or had a bad decision or something.
Remember me for my bad moment back one time, not all my great moments.
There you go.
So George Washington's my number one, hands down.
I didn't.
So,
be any different.
So what I'm going to say about George Washington, just like Robert E. Lee was in the Civil War on both sides, it is like he's here and everybody's here down there by my knee, me standing up. Even the generals from England, they were too busy bickering at each other and fighting amongst each other that George Washington, he could see it. And the understanding, I said this once when we first started our podcast, he understood that he could never fight the British head on until they had an adequate army to do it. So what he had to do is play cat and mouse the whole time, which takes a lot of strategy. And if you look at what he did in New York in the early times, having enough forces to keep their forces there, but moving the main force away, but having enough to keep them held was important, but still not having a decisive loss where his people got slaughtered, because he would have lost the will of the nation, of the future nation, if he'd done that. And he sat there and he ran back and forth, and he found two good generals, which Jean Lafitte, who was only 21 years old.
That's ridiculous.
Dude, 21 years old and kicking major ass. He was the bull in the china shop for him. He was his blunt instrument. He was his Jackson or Sherman. And then he had Nathaniel Greene, who was a quartermaster guy, who showed them infantry guys how to do it. And those two guys there, under the guidance of George Washington, saved us and made us a country. But it was George Washington realizing the culminating event, of course, was Yorktown. And then he just streamlined everything down there and said, let's go hand their ass to them. I mean, as a tactician, it's not even close in the American Revolution, just because he saw the complete theater and he understood that they could not take a loss ever. Well, back to your Valley Forge things. Is he had to do whatever it took. So.
When I think another thing with Washington, I think about is he understood, just like coaches do. If you've got a defensive line with Reggie White and all these great guys on it, you got to realize you can't run. Right out. You've got to get around them. You've got to do something. So don't go to someone's strength. I think that's what Washington always did. He realized that what someone's strength was, he wasn't going to deal with that. He was going to go to the weakness. And as a coach, sometimes you have to, when you're watching film, you go, okay, my gosh, this guy here on the left side, he is a beast. So I need to go to the right side. And if I am going to go left side, I'm double teaming this guy. But I think there's a lot of times generals and coaches, really good coaches. I think like Bill Walsh, Tom Landry, Eric Coryell, Don Coryell, John Madden. Some of these guys would have been great generals just because they understood their strengths, they understood the weaknesses they had, they also understood their enemy, what their strengths and weaknesses was, and had to deal with that. And just like some of the game we talked about a Super Bowl coming up. If you got Pat Mahomes, you're not going to be worried too much about the running game as you are him. I mean, you just can't, even though you do have a couple of good running backs. Le'Veon Bell's going to be back, by the way. But anyway, you have to realize that if this is your guy, then if you're the general, you've got to go, okay, that's their strength. What am I going to do?
So one thing I want to say, because my experience in the Army, I've served with a lot of generals, and there are certain generals that I've told my wife that they'll solve the problem. I'm deployed with them and things of that nature. And I'll give a good example is, and I won't name the units, because I don't want to paint one bad, but we was having a problem with ISIS in Iraq. And I came out of Liberia with General Bolesky, the 101st, I won't name his unit, the 101st commander. And as I came out of there, they go, he had a few months break, took a knee, and they go, he's going to Iraq. And I looked at my wife and said, the problem's about to be solved. You can see that when you're around them, which generals can do that and which can't. And I'm like, problem's about to be solved. He's about to solve it. And then I moved to another job, and I got to work for the Corps commander, which was General Townsend, which was his boss. And they moved him over there, and I'm like, it's definitely solved now with both of them in theater. And sure enough, it was done.
If you're a leader, you're a leader.
Yeah, and you can see it. So, hey, we want to hear your top 5 generals because you may have some different ones than what we have.
I learned a lot.
Yes.
That's what I love about this. Sometimes you might learn a little something from me about maybe musicians or whatever, and I learn a lot about you anytime it comes to generals, war, things like that. But that's what we want you all to learn something. And so also tell us some topics that you'd like to hear. We have some good ones that come up from other people recently. And we still got one coming up, and I want to mention it because I think a lot of times people that will listen to this one will also want to listen to that, and maybe we ought to even talk about it more. We have a guy that supports Black Lives Matter in our area, and he's a great guy, and he's a young guy, and he's going to sit down with us in the next few weeks, and we're going to discuss this and try to figure out a way to understand each other. You have got to talk. You've got to talk. So that's what I tell my students all the time. You've got to have debate. Without debate, you have no understanding.
Cool. So from the coach
to the vet.
Stay tuned, stay tuned, stay tuned.